Hi, Misha here, and been doing a lot of videos on the main channel lately, recording them for Mishaco, and also been doing a lot of videos on airplanes and ships. I just wanted to do something more relaxing and fun, talk about some more Star Trek stuff, but there haven't been any real new models to speak of from Eagle Moss this summer for kind of obvious reasons. So I've started kind of arranging ships in fun little patterns, and in this video I thought we would look at the more or less dedicated science ships or configurations of ships for science, and that will include like survey missions and things of that nature, just basically pure research of one type or another. And I don't know, seems kind of fitting since Starfleet is often said not to be a military until it is a military, and then it's not a military again. It's pretty clear it's both. So these would be the science ships from the early days of Starfleet, pre-Federation through the early Federation, and the later days of the Federation. And with that, really have to start at the first pure research ship we see in Season 2 of Enterprise, the Starfleet Transport, aka Arctic 1. This is in the Borg episode of Regeneration, the one the Borgs rejiggered to make into something else. But it starts off the episode as Arctic Transport. Now that has the skis like this model here, but we also see the same model used in Enterprise without skis, so they seem to be optional equipment for Arctic operations. And we definitely see this in space, so this is primarily a little ground-to-space ship, both. It's about 50 meters long, so respectably large for that era. And seems to have a crew of at least maybe 4 or 5, and the ability to carry 20 or so people. And it has research bays that can be configured for different purposes. I would assume these could also be used as transports. And it does have warp, although it doesn't look like it. It can get up to warp 1.4, so enough to get around a star system. People forget sometimes that space is big, and even if you want to get from one planet to another in the same star system, unless you want to take 6 months or even longer to get there, going at light speed is pretty necessary. I mean, just from the sun to Earth is over 8 minutes at light speed, so going at warp 1.4 means you could pretty much get to anywhere in the solar system in, well, certainly under a day. Depends how you want to define the outbound. But yeah, this was pre any kind of weapons. It didn't have weapons. It did have polarized hull plating for maybe going into more hostile environments, and was just a pure research ship. Of course, the Borg didn't like that, and they did some remodeling. But it kind of shows the roots. Next up, we have the Sarajevo type, as seen, is more of a background ship in Season 4 of Enterprise. This is sometimes called in media an elite observation craft, meaning that it could have gone to planets and made studies. It's also been called a yacht. It definitely has lots of room, which would be good for research. Could also be used as a transport. It did have phase cannons, probably photonic torpedoes as well, so it's verging on being a starship, but it doesn't seem to be a deep space explorer, more of a close-in to Earth ship. And it was capable of about warp 3. And it's quite a bit larger, at about 200 meters, and considering how thick it is, it had probably a pretty good internal volume and could carry quite a bit of research equipment, survey equipment, maybe even help as a colony ship. But it doesn't seem to be a frontline combat ship at all. or even a deep space explorer. So I'm lumping it in kind of with the science-y end of things. I like the design. It's different while still being Starfleet, and I was tickled. I said in early videos, if Eagle Moss would at least come out with this one, I'd be happy, because it kind of finishes out the Enterprise era Starfleet ships, and they did a really good job with it. Moving on, this one is not exactly pure science, maybe, but I like the model and wanted to bring out a dozen, so I did. This is the Daedalus class, pretty famous, mentioned a lot in TOS and not really seen until the Deep Space Nine era. This seems to be one of the first ships launched after the Romulan War, around 2161, and was kind of a replacement for the NX. The NX was capable of Warp 5, this was more like Warp 7, but on the other hand, it seems to be much more dedicated to science, to like exploration, yes, but also with more of a sense of survey and first contact, so researching cultures. It's a relatively short ship, only about 140 meters, and it has a crew of nearly 230, which, yeah, I get that the sphere would give a little more space. It has a very large engineering hull. I don't know. But yeah, this seemed to be the premier ship of Starfleet during a time of peace between the 2160s and the beginning of the 22nd century. It seems like most were tired out by that time. Yeah, the Sarajevo is a very heavy model. Doesn't want to stand on its stand. Stay there. I always thought the Daedalus was interesting, and they're in several episodes. There's the Horizon, of course. There's the Essex. But it doesn't seem to have been a very good ship for any kind of combat or durability use, which is why it was kind of replaced in frontline service by ships like the Constitution. And speaking of the 23rd century, we see this ship here. Yet another Antares class, the name they really love using. This is from Charlie X, specifically remastered. In the original 60s broadcast, there wasn't a model. It's actually based on a model from the animated series from the 1970s. This is the USS Antares, NCC 501, so it's definitely an older ship. We also see the USS Woden and a few others in TOS Remastered. This could be considered a transport, and I nearly put it in the transport and freighter video I did, but I don't know. It seems like in transport mode it doesn't lack this forward section. Has a crew of 20, so not a large one. It's not a very big ship. It too, like the Daedalus, is probably about 140 meters, give or take. Not especially fast ship. Probably around Warp 4. With just basic amenities. But it is said to be a survey craft, so maybe surveying for new colony sites or what have you, so it does have pretty good sensors. It has larger cargo bays and larger room for that kind of equipment than a Constitution, and it can carry modules. The design is weird and not really neat. Like, this would definitely not be a hero ship, but it's something to fly alongside the Enterprise and make the Enterprise look all the more grand This is just kind of an old workhorse ship of Starfleet. Durable enough, easy to operate on a small crew, and good to send out for maybe long duration planetary missions and sciencey things when you don't want to tie up something like a Constitution class. And I always like seeing new ships from the TOS era. As I say in the Transport Freighter video talking about the J class, I like that in the TOS Remastered they kept the 60s aesthetic of pretty basic geometric shapes and very slick hulls. It doesn't necessarily make for neat ships, but it makes them fit in well to the universe. But then we get into the first 100% pure science ship we ever see in Star Trek. The most sciencey ship that ever scienced and would science for a very long time, the Oberth-class. Going chronologically in the real world and discounting TOS, the animated, or TAS I should say, the animated series, this is the third Starfleet design we see. First being Constitution, of course. Second being the Miranda. This was in Star Trek 3, Search for Spock. And we learn a few things pretty quick. It is a science ship, a survey ship, a research ship, and seems to be dedicated to that purpose. It's not heavily armed, and it's not heavily shielded. At least not against weapons fire. We do find out later that it is well protected against a lot of more natural phenomenon, which would make sense for a research ship. It also, we can infer by its design, is a quite new system. It doesn't seem to be a revamped TOS ship. It does seem to be pretty cutting edge for the late 23rd century, which makes sense because in the early mid-23rd century, the Federation has an uneasy truce with the Romulans, even though it's a quiet one, and a not very uneasy truce with the Klingons, so they seem to be hedging their bets and putting more effort into ships with combat abilities. But by the 2380s and early 2390s, relations are much better, and they kind of do the pure science thing again. We see this ship still being heavily used to the 24th century, and I could even see it beyond, because it seems to be very modular and adaptable. Roughly, it's about 150 meters long, so it kind of fits in with the other science ships we've seen, and has a crew of about 80, and seems to be able to capable of respectable warp of around 7, reasonably fast. I do feature it in my transports video because these are sometimes used as long-range transports for important missions, and they were used for a lot of things. But it only has basic phasers, and some may have a basic photon torpedo system, but these are more for defense, or at most maybe protecting against natural phenomenon, breaking up asteroids. They do have good sensors, as you'd expect. Interestingly, this pod on the bottom is often called an engineering hull, but I think, and I think the original designers intended it to be more of a survey sensor pod hanging down, because when we first see this ship, the USS Grissom, it is surveying the Genesis planet. And it just wouldn't make sense to have your warp nacelles nice and compacted up here, and then have your warp drive way down here connected by just two skinny little pylons. And the thing is, the geometry just doesn't work about how you could easily get from one section to another. Could you get there? I'm sure. But it would make sense that this is more or less an automated sensor package, collector, or cargo pod. Meaning it could detach and just have the top part by itself. And really, if you detach it, the top part looks like a neat little compact survey ship. I don't know, I like the design, and the Eagle Moss did a good job with the model because it's so large, at least comparatively speaking. But this is truly a dedicated science research ship, and one that the Federation uses for a very long time. A little bit different, we have the Miranda-class. And for this one, I opted to use Cisco's ship, the USS Saratoga, which is actually the second Miranda-class to bear the name. We know that they're different because they have different registry numbers, so we presume that one was retired and another one put in its place. And this is a bit of a modular ship. We see at least 5 variations throughout Star Trek, meaning obviously it was pretty adaptable. We also know that it's in production for 100 years. It seems like these came into service in a TOS form, at least, around 2245. We definitely know they're in service by the 2260s, at least the USS Reliant is. And then they, like the Constitutions, get a motion picture era refit. I think it would be neat if Eagle Moss did a concept model in the special editions of a TOS style Miranda with the old school nacelles, straight pylons, and smooth hull. I'd enjoy that. But we know they still are making these at least into the 2340s. And this model here, the Saratoga, even though it was featured at the Battle of Wolf 359, seems to be more of a science ship. It has the weapons bar, or the roll bar, removed, and it has these extensive sensor pods, probably long range, on each side, and the weapon systems have been moved into the hull, meaning they probably have less importance than the sensors. And the captain was a Vulcan, so yeah, this seems like it'd be a good candidate for science ship. And I just thought it would be worth mentioning the Miranda here. It's about 235 meters long, and it was a starship, had a crew of about 200. In other roles, this could be reduced way down to well under 50. And it was capable of good speeds. It could get up to about warp 9 by the TNG era and whatnot. Of course, you get into the whole different warp scales, this thing, but it was capable of good defense, even as a science ship, and kind of just a nice, all-around, well-rounded workhorse of the fleet. And it wasn't until the 2360s that it seems to have been kind of replaced, at least in the frontline service, by this ship. Next up, we have the Nebula. Come on. These things are hard to do when you can't see. And right away, you'll notice that the Nebula here takes this basic layout with the nacelles slung down low. Now this adds a deflector dish. And much like the Miranda, it had something on top, but instead of a roll bar that could be on or off, it has a pod that could be mounted, meaning this could be configured for several situations. In other guises, this was a medium cruiser, medium range explorer. There was also a combat variant with a combat pod, but this one here, the USS Phoenix, has a high-powered long-range sensor pod, which would definitely be more of a science, maybe military research craft, but still getting into the tech side of things. This is the second time we see this in the episode The Wounded. We see the Nebula-class. The first time we see wreckage in the opening of Season 4 of TNG, at the graveyard scene. This is the first time we really see the ship up close in its full detail glory. And I really like it. And I like that it has the design lineage of the Miranda. So if the Galaxy replaced the Constitution, this replaced the Miranda. And this is definitely the more science-y style. And I like the idea that a ship could be pretty easily and quickly reconfigured for different missions because you don't know. Space is big, and sometimes you need a transport mission, sometimes you need a military mission, sometimes you need survey, science, exploration, blah blah blah. This model has been a little criticized from Eagle Moss, but it was early on. I think they did a perfectly okay job. And they've done several Nebula variants now, so if you don't like one, get a different one. But I think it carries on that science-y tradition. And something to remember too, this era, the mid-24th century, it was another time of peace, kind of continuing on with the peace that was won in the late 23rd. So a lot of ships didn't focus on war at this time. In fact, virtually none did. And so they all were more dedicated to science. So you really could put any of the TNG era ships in this spot, but I chose the Nebula. A lot of the other ships at the Wolf 359 scene, we don't really know. Like for the Springfield, maybe it was science, but we don't know. But we do know that this one had the science pod on it, so there it is. And another one I've selected that was in my transports video, and this is probably better in this one, but I like the model. The SS Raven type, sometimes called the Raven class or the Jeffries class. We don't know. This was the one that 7 of 9's parents took stupidly into the Beta Quadrant and then eventually got swept into the Delta. We know a few things about it. Oh, by the way, the Nebula, just throw it out there. This variant's about 465 meters long and has a crew of 7 to 800. And of course, standard defenses, photon torpedoes. We know it's pretty powerful based on the episode, so it's a science ship, but with teeth. Anywho, moving forward/back, because actually in universe, this was flying around in the 2350s, but it has more of a modern design, kind of the box. This is a forerunner of what would probably become the runabout. It's about 90 meters long. It's said to have 4 decks, which I'm not sure I completely buy, but hey, whatever. It is kind of boxy, so maybe one deck's a little short. It does even have a small little shuttle bay in the back, which would make sense for any kind of research, probably just carrying small pods like Type 15s. I figure if Voyager could fit about 108 shuttles in its bay, this could fit at least, 50. We do know that it was capable of quite good warp. We don't really know how much. We know that it could go for long duration missions. So it had replicators and everything on board. And it definitely had research and study facilities, science facilities. It definitely was not a combat vessel. But it seems to be very advanced for its day, so pretty much a specialist vessel. And again, it goes to show you that Starfleet was really concerned more with science and that during the 24th century. Yeah, I just think it's a neat design, so why not bring it out, huh? I could put a runabout here too, but I tend to feel that runabouts were used, at least in Deep Space Nine, more for either transport or combat, like fighters. You don't really see them used for a lot of research purposes. If they're a research craft, then I would say that any shuttle would be considered that as well. And with that, we'll move on to the more modern ships. The Olympic-class. Specifically, this is the USS Pasteur from the final episode of Next Generation. Also in Deep Space Nine, during the Dominion War, there is the USS Nobel. This is a hospital ship, a rescue ship. And I'm including it in the sciences because medicine is science, and I'm sure ships like these would be called upon more than once to do research into curing a disease or whatnot. So, more of a medical research, which is interesting to see a dedicated medical ship. Of course, in Universe it happened because it was Crusher's command, but why would they not have a hospital ship? Real world navies have dedicated hospital ships, so Starfleet would too. It's interesting that they've gone back to the spherical hull, which is one other reason I went ahead and brought the Daedalus out for this video, because it seems like that is more of a science-y shape. It has a large shuttle bay, which makes sense because it would need to be able to launch and retrieve multiple larger rescue shuttles or supply shuttles. It has good warp speed, which is good for a hospital ship to get places quickly, but like other science-y ships, very minimal weaponry and relatively light shields. It's about 320 meters long. We don't really know a crew. Any crew numbers would just be a guess. But it's an interesting design. And thanks to the overall length, I think it makes a little more sense than the Daedalus, frankly. There's quite a bit of space in this ship. In the real world, this design was actually not made internally by the folks at Star Trek, but was a fan design that was submitted and accepted. And now we move into the kind of era of CGI. Now I have the Saber out, Saber-class. And I kind of do this under protest. We first see this in First Contact, fighting the Borg Cube. And we see these in the Dominion War. Officially, this is a destroyer or light cruiser. It's about 190 meters long, but obviously quite wide. Much like newer ships like the Defiant, it has a small crew of about 40 or 50. It does have a smallish shuttle bay, and it has what appear to be basically forward arcing weapons. Now this would seem to be, based on on-screen appearances, a warship, a fighter, kind of analogous to maybe the Defiant. But some canon, and a lot of beta canon, also say that it was a science ship, that it has powerful sensors and a nice robust hull for going into hazardous situations for science-y purposes. Kind of makes me wonder if that was just the excuse the designers in Starfleet came up with to propose building a ton of these for the Federation. But it seems to at least have a secondary role as a science ship, a planetary surveyor, patrol ship, what have you. And so I decided to go ahead and include it here for completeness' sake. Plus it is an interesting design and a good model from Eagle Moss. So maybe a bit of a jack of all trades, honestly. But I like it. It's not really just, it doesn't seem like a science ship to me. Now we come to the potentially most modern, the Nova-class and its Rhode Island refit. The Nova gets actually a good bit of screen time, as it was kind of a guest hero ship in the end season episode of Season 5 into Season 6 of Voyager, the USS Equinox, lost in the Delta Quadrant. And so we actually get more information about it than we would quite a bit of other ships, and we get to see a good bit of its interior. It is specifically stated to be a science ship, a planetary surveyor, and canon has it that this was kind of the replacement for the Oberth and for some of the Mirandas. Makes sense. It is about 220 meters long, and it has about 8 decks and a crew of roughly 80, at least the Equinox did. It's also capable of relatively high warp, but not as fast as an Intrepid class. I think they might have said 8 or 9 in the episode. Doesn't matter. It has a lot of sciency stuff on board, which the Equinox crews used to get as far as they did in the Delta Quadrant. And for once, when the Federation, when Starfleet designed a science ship, they had this wonderful idea of how about we give it good shields and respectable armament. And we know it's not as armored and armed as the Intrepid, because it's clearly stated it's tactically inferior, but it's also not a pushover like the Oberth. So it could take a licking and keep on warping. Now in the real world, this design evolved from one of the study concepts for the Defiant from Deep Space Nine, hence why it has a few unique features like the concave bridge, and just more of a maybe aggressive appearance than you would expect from a science ship. Some have also called it a baby sovereign, which I can get. It really fits into the design really well. Yet, it has things like the boxy nacelles and whatnot that do kind of make it look a little more sciencey and less sleek. I think it's often been a fan favorite. But yeah, this would be the new generation of science ships in the mid to late 24th century. And it makes sense for it to be better armed and armored because Starfleet was kind of getting out of its next golden age at the time. Get out of my way. And you can definitely tell the vessels based on if they're more or less in peaceful time or not. And likewise, the final one here, the Rhodo Island. This is from Voyager's final episode. This variant was seen around the year 2400, 2410, something like that. Future. But based on the registry number, it seems to exist. And was Harry Kim's ship. And given that he was in operations and liked science, it's reasonable to think that it was just an update of a science ship. On the underside, it's pretty well unchanged. On the top, though, we get away from the concave bridge, go to a more standard bridge, and the nacelles are a little more streamlined and less boxy. In the real world, they were just going to reuse the Equinox for the endgame episode, but the art directors and designers decided to go ahead and just redo and do a few changes for free, basically. And I think it comes across quite well. It's nice to see a refit. But even though in the episode we see that it's pretty well armed tactically, we have no reason to think that the class is not a science ship. I can't imagine them taking a science hull and trying to make it into a warship. They just probably updated it. Faster warp. Whatnot. And that's about the most modern Starfleet science ship we see. Again, I played a little fast and loose with these just to have enough on the table. The majority of Starfleet ships are multi-purpose explorers, and towards the end, more and more combat-oriented, which is funny for a non-military. But it is truthful to say, if we look at the early Enterprise stuff, that early on they were a mix of science ships and explorer ships. And then getting into the TOS era, we don't see a lot of pure science ships, because they were in a Cold War with the Klingons, and it's kind of ridiculous. But they do start to appear in the late 23rd century and through the 24th during peacetime. Even having older ships reworked to be a science. And newer ships kind of being made multi-purpose that can be used for science. Even some flown by civilians. Some with very specialized purposes. And then, though, as aggressions crop up again, we have to start sticking more weapons on them and thinking about the safety of our crews, because, well, they're not Klingons after all. Anyway, just trying to do these for fun, so if you could, like, share, and subscribe, and as always, I appreciate it. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.